Money doesn't just change lifestyles. It changes how people look at you. The moment someone becomes wealthy, something strange happens. Some people admire them, some people study them, and others instantly begin to hate them, not because they know them personally, but because wealth triggers emotions: jealousy, frustration, anger, insecurity, division. And in this video, we're going to explore the psychology behind why many poor people resent the rich. Ready? Let's get to it.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a radically objective look at something that's practically everywhere right now: the deeply rooted, intensely emotional dynamic of wealth resentment. I mean, the tension between the rich and the poor is definitely not new, but lately it just feels louder than ever. We're not here to take sides, we aren't defending billionaires, and we're not validating any political movements. We're just going to look strictly at the psychology, the hard data, and the societal structures that create this massive divide. To really get to the bottom of this, we have to start with basic human nature. And honestly, one of the hardest emotions for human beings to handle is comparison. Just think about it. When you see someone else living out a life of total financial freedom, driving that dream car, living in an incredible home, traveling wherever they want, it can create some serious frustration, especially if you're feeling stuck, overworked, or financially strained in your own life. Seeing someone else's absolute success just becomes this glaring, inescapable reminder of exactly what you don't have. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to unpack this whole issue layer by layer. First, we'll look at the psychology of comparison, then clear up some major misconceptions about the rich. After that, we'll cover the great resource divide, the reality of power, rules, and inheritance, and finally, wrap up with the modern wealth trap. Starting with part 1, the psychology of comparison. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Wealth exposes possibilities. And when you're struggling, just seeing the sheer possibilities that money represents can spark incredible envy. It's totally natural, but envy is an incredibly destructive emotion. Why? Because it literally forces you to count somebody else's blessings instead of focusing on building your own. It condemns people to this unbreakable cycle where they're constantly looking outward with bitterness rather than looking inward with ambition. And this envy, it's often baked in from childhood. A lot of us grow up hearing things like, rich people are greedy, or money's the root of all evil, right? Over time, those ideas turn into a deeply rooted psychological trap. If you've been taught your whole life that gaining wealth means you have to exploit other people, well, you naturally start taking a sort of moral pride in your own lack of wealth. You end up inherently resenting the very concept of money, seeing poverty as a badge of honor and wealth as just pure corruption. But to really grasp how wealth works, we've got to reframe that completely. Money is simply a tool. That's it. It doesn't create character, it just amplifies whatever is already there. A generous person who suddenly gets rich is going to use that money to help thousands of people and build incredible value. On the flip side, a selfish person is going to use it to cause destruction. Blaming the money completely misses the human element pulling the strings. Moving on to part 2, misconceptions about the rich. Now, what's really interesting about this is how the belief that nobody gets rich honestly acts as a massive emotional shield. Think about it. If you believe all wealth is just cheating and exploitation, it completely protects you from having to face some pretty uncomfortable truths about your own effort, discipline, or your willingness to take risks. But reality is a whole lot more complex. The truth is, immense wealth is usually built on years of sacrifice, relentless innovation, and some incredibly strategic investments. Because of all those negative assumptions, there's a huge disconnect about what living wealthy actually looks like day to day. People assume the rich are just kicking back, completely stress-free, sipping mojitos on the beach all day. But behind the scenes, wealth brings intense business stress, ridiculously complex taxes, serious security concerns, constant threats of lawsuits, massive responsibility for employees, and brutal public scrutiny. Yes, money absolutely removes a lot of problems, for sure, but it replaces them with an entirely different, incredibly heavy set of burdens. That brings us to part 3, the great resource divide. Look, we have to empathize with the very real frustration that comes from extreme economic inequality. When you're working 2 or 3 jobs and still barely scraping together enough to pay rent, watching someone casually drop $100,000 on a wristwatch, that feels like a slap in the face. This extreme contrast completely validates the anger of the working class. It physically feels like there are 2 totally different, entirely disconnected worlds existing right side by side. That being said, the actual mechanics of how that wealth is stored are heavily misunderstood. People love to picture billionaires acting like cartoon villains, hoarding massive mountains of gold coins in a vault, actively keeping resources away from the poor. But that's just not true. Rich people stay rich by keeping their money moving. Their capital is tied up in stocks, in companies that produce actual goods, solve major problems, innovate new tech, and employ hundreds of thousands of people. The money is actively working in the economy. It's not just sitting idle under a mattress. Which leads us to part 4, power, rules, and inheritance. All right, here is the painful, objective truth. Money changes the rules of life, period. Wealth creates superior access. It literally buys better education, better healthcare, top-tier legal protection, and access to these powerful, incredibly exclusive networks. The rules of the modern world just respond differently to capital. And when people wake up to this reality, they naturally, and honestly rightfully, resent a system that feels completely rigged to protect the winners, while penalizing everyone else who's just trying to climb up. And this brilliantly illustrates one of the biggest triggers for that anger, the idea of effortless inheritance. Wealthy families just passing down unfair advantages generation after generation. But the hard data offers a seriously surprising counterpoint here. According to a major Fidelity survey, a whopping 88% of millionaires are actually self-made. Only 12% inherited their wealth. So while the access gap is 100% real, the vast majority of modern wealth is actually newly created by people who learned how to navigate the system, not just people who were handed the keys to it. Yet, for the folks without that wealth, the psychological toll is just incredibly heavy. You see, poverty isn't just about not having money. It's a fundamental lack of power. Without resources, people feel totally ignored by politicians, voiceless in society, invisible to the media, and completely trapped. And human beings are always going to resent a system and the people running it if they feel entirely excluded from having any say in their own lives. Finally, part 5, the modern wealth trap. Think about it. A few decades ago, wealth was relatively private. You didn't see it every day. But today, social media has poured absolute gasoline on wealth comparison. We are constantly bombarded with private jets, designer brands, and millionaire lifestyles every single time we open our phones. And honestly, even though a massive chunk of what we see online is totally fake or rented, it still creates this enormous, crushing emotional pressure on the viewer. This constant, hyper-visible display of extreme luxury, especially when it's paired with real arrogance from the top, has a devastating effect. It unintentionally makes the average, hardworking person feel completely left in the dust. I mean, they're working exhausting hours, doing everything right, and yet their feed is flooded with teenagers driving supercars. When hard work feels unrewarded and people feel unseen, resentment just spreads like wildfire. So, the crucial point is this. What do we actually do with this information? We've diagnosed the envy, the unfair access, the systemic issues, and the digital gasoline fueling the fire. But we have to stop and ask ourselves a deeply psychological question. Does hatred actually improve anyone's life? Really? Does resenting the wealthy put money in your bank account? Does it improve your skills or get you any closer to financial freedom? The objective, undeniable answer is no. The ultimate takeaway here is that studying success is infinitely more powerful than resenting it. If you want to change your circumstances, you've got to first understand how wealth actually works. Learn how the systems and the rules operate without the emotional bias. Put your focus on improving your own life and breaking that toxic cycle of comparison. So I'll leave you with this. If you spent the exact same amount of energy analyzing success as you do resenting it, where could you be a year from today?